Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my first tutorial on Final Cut Pro. I'll be getting a lot of questions from my colleagues in the industry, those who I've taught. They'd like, now that I'm no longer a full-time editor, they would like to have some sort of permanent record on how to start up Final Cut Pro. You know, the basics. So I've got my home-built Hackintosh here. It's already got a number of drives plugged into it. This is my big 2 GB drive. Big. Back when I started editing, this was monstrous, and now it's nothing. My system drive, some network drives, and the client drive that we're going to be working off of. One of the lessons we'll be learning today is how to switch your scratch drive and designate a client drive as your scratch drive. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to launch Final Cut Pro. It should load up pretty quickly, and if it doesn't, I'll edit it. Alright, I'm going to close this existing project and start a new one because you guys wanted to see it from the scratch. So new project, and the first thing I always do is save the project. Now, a lot of debate on where you should save your project. Personally, I like doing it on a drive separate from my capture scratch. Should my capture scratch drive, my 2 terabyte G drive, die in some horrible disaster, then my project file is on a separate drive. For instance, my system drive or my network drive, something like that. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to specifically say a client has supplied us with a drive, and they're going to want to have all of the files that we're editing back on this drive. So we're just going to save the project file here and hope the computer doesn't crash. Speaking of which, of course, we're going to come into system, before we go into system settings, let's go into user preferences, make sure everything's right here. What are you looking for when you're asking what's wrong here, Greg? Well, you want to make sure your levels of undo are at least 10, but the most important thing to me is how often does your computer save a backup copy? 10 minutes would be the maximum time. I actually prefer it at 5. My old Mac at my previous job crashed so often, I like to have backup copies quite frequently, but my new computer that I built myself doesn't crash near as often, so every 10 minutes should work. Everything else should be okay unless you've been fiddling with it, like still freeze duration or, you know, everything else should be fine as long as you don't mess with it. So we're going to leave that alone. Okay. Next up would be the system settings. Now this is where you're actually going to set what drive is going to hold all of the files. Your scratch files go here, and your autosaves go here. Now, like I said before, since we're going to be putting the project file on the client drive with all of the client's files, you don't want to put your autosave on the save drive. Don't want to do that. So we're going to make sure that it's on a different drive, and indeed it's on my system drive. So that's fine. Waveform cache and thumbnail cache, the client doesn't need these. Those are completely irrelevant. Unless, of course, you're dealing with something embargoed and for legal reasons you can't save even a cache file of that, but we're not going to get into that. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial. This one right here, therefore, is the most important setting. You want your video capture, your video render, and your audio render files. These two can actually go on a different drive, your render files, but they might as well go on the client drive. So when you disconnect the client drive and send it off to the client, he gets all of his garbage render files too. So make sure these 3 are checked off, and you're going to, I'm going to set the client drive now as my second drive here. And I'm going to check off those and uncheck them from my primary work drive. So now everything I'm capturing and rendering is going to be saved on the client drive. That That feels good. Yes. All right. So now we've got it, the project named. We've got the scratch drive selected. And you're probably wondering, hey, Greg, why don't we do the easy setup? Why don't we select what we're working in? And I'm here to tell you right now, this is pretty much irrelevant. This is just selecting what the basic setup is going to be for your computer. I've got it set up for these settings because I don't have any outboard hardware like a video deck or anything plugged into it. Frankly, it doesn't really matter because once I start working with the timeline, all of that could change. Speaking of which, the timeline. Let's take a look at this. We're going to open this up, and you're going to hit the Command key, the little four-leaf clover next to the keyboard, and the 0 key at the same time. It brings up sequence settings, which of course you could get through the sequence menu. And oh, look at this! Look at this! We've got some. We do have some funky settings here: non-square pixels and Apple ProRes, and instead of whatever else you might be working with. Just take note of what this is because it's all about to change in just a second. Now, how do we import files? This was also been asked of me a lot. Well, you could go import files or folder and bring things in from the client drive that way. Notice all the new folders we've got now that we selected this drive as the scratch drive. So we've got audio files and video files. I'm going to import this folder of audio files, and look at that. Look, see, now we've got this nice little audio file that's been imported. But frankly, it's just as easy to Command tab over to the Finder and grab the folders that you want and just drag them in. That's all you really got to do. If they're compatible files with Final Cut Pro, they will import. If they're not compatible, it's going to complain at you. So I hope for your sake they're compatible because that's a completely different tutorial on how to conform audio files. So I've got some video files from different things that I've done and a single audio file underneath it. So we're going to just demonstrate here what happens when you start adding files to your timeline. For instance, this was taken on my honeymoon. And look at this. When I take this file, drop it on the timeline, you remember before we already have the timeline settings set. It's now wanting to change the timeline settings to match the settings on this file. If I say no, then notice the bar here is green instead of the normal gray. Now something I'm going to unlink so I can get rid of the audio. I don't want that playing in the background. So now, yeah, it plays, but it's not completely smooth because it's having to do some on-the-fly rendering. Ooh, cows in Hawaii. The luckiest cows in the world. Except for the whole beef industry thing. So that was, I got lucky here. Everything seems to work out. But what if it's a completely different type of file, like this one, from when I shot an opera last year? Change? No, I don't want to change. Oh, look. Now Rigoletto has got the black pillar boxes. That doesn't work. So if I do it again, yes, now everything's changed. Now we're no longer pillar boxed. We're now proper 4:3 ratio for an old mini. Actually, I shot this like 3 years ago now that I think about it, because this was on mini DV. So it has completely changed the format of the timeline. And notice up here at the top of the timeline, it's not green or blue or red or orange or yellow. It's gray, which means it's native. It'll play back perfectly, even if it is a bit grainy. This is the same for anything we drop down. Oh, yeah. Now we left the timeline here, 4:3 aspect ratio for mini DV. I'm now dropping a high definition cat video onto it. What if I say no here? Well, now instead of pillar boxes, we've got letter boxes on the top and bottom as our two cats fight it out. And instead of having a gray bar, it's now green again. If I do this again, drop it down and say yes, fit to window, and now look at this. It's a properly formatted 16:9 video of my cats just beating the snot out of each other. Oh, aren't they cute as they fight? Yeah. So that, in a nutshell, is why I don't bother setting the timeline settings, the sequence settings as they call it in Final Cut Pro. Let's go back to Command 0. See, we're back in high definition space, but if I bring down and drop Rigoletto back in, set it, it changes, Command 0 again, and now all the settings are changed. It has now conformed the timeline to fit the video. Now you're saying, well, what if I've done this, Greg? I've conformed the timeline, the sequence, to 4:3 aspect ratio for mini DV. What happens when I drop in your cow video next to it? We go from full frame to letterbox. What if it's the other way around? We drop in the Haleakala cows, conform that, then drop in Rigoletto next to that. The cows are full frame, but Rigoletto is now pillar boxed on both sides. So, very important when you're just starting out and starting a new project with a new sequence, when you drop your first clip, and if you tell it, drop that first clip, tell it yes, conform it, that is going to be the format for the rest of your project. On the other hand, if you've gone into settings here and you've loaded up a preset and you know this is the preset you want, when you drop your first clip in, say no and do something else to make that clip work with the new size, the new frame size. Yeah, of course it's green now and it's not going to want to, it's complaining at me. All right. Okay. I was also asked about nesting videos. I know you're sad. You're sad because people make fun of you because you're a hunchback. I know. It's okay, Rigoletto. All right. So, nested sequences. So let's, if I right-click, I can bring up a new sequence. If I come up here to File, New Sequence. If I hit Command N, New Sequence. Now I got 4 sequences. Sequence 1 is now going to be renamed Master. Sequence 2, I'm going to call Act 1. Sequence 3, Act 2. And Sequence 4 becomes, naturally, Fred. Yes, I call my sequences Fred. Alright, so we've got the master sequence here, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 is called Fred. And in Act 1, we visit Haleakala and see cows. Yes, I'm going to conform this sequence to match Haleakala cows. Check that out. Act 2, we see an opera, and people die, because, you know, all operas people die. And in Act Fred, a crazy woman comes on the scene and dances in front of a green screen. That's right. She is also followed by cats. You following along? So, I've got 3 acts. Act 1, Hawaii. Act 2, Rigoletto. Act Fred, crazy woman in front of a green screen, and cats. In the master timeline, I'm now going to take Act 1, drop it into the master timeline. Do I want it to conform? No, in fact I don't, because you cannot nest sequences with different editing time bases. Oh, I forgot about that. Alright, so Act 1, I drop that in, and yes, I shall conform it, because in order for it to drop in here, the editing time base, the frame rate, 29.97 frames per second, 23.98 frames per second, 3 frames per second, 60 frames per second, whatever it has to be, they both have to be the same. So you're going to want to conform it. But look at this. Act 1 is now sitting inside of the master timeline. Act 2, Rigoletto. We're going to drop this in here. And look at that. We now have Act 1 and Act 2 sitting next to each other. Act 2 needs rendering. Now Act Fred, we drop that. And all three of them are together. Now, what this implies is, of course, you can have 3, 4, 28 different pieces of whatever project, documentary, feature film, music video, 20-second commercial, I don't care, nested within subclips. This makes for excellent organization, especially if whatever's in Act 1 isn't in Act Fred. So you just double click on it and it opens it up. We can now, oh, look at all that. We got some screwy clips here, so I'm going to shorten it there. We got too many cows. There are too many cows having lunch. So I'm just going to trim this up, bring it back. And now if I go back to the master, Act 1 is cleaned up. I can do the same to Act 2. I just want that zoom in. I don't want the wide shot before. So I trim that up, bring it back to the beginning, come back to the master, and it's trimmed up. Act Fred. We can do something really quick here. Let's see. Do I remember how to do this? Of course I do. Key. Chroma keyer. This is not a very good chroma keyer, but it wasn't a very good screen either. And I'm going to eyedropper right about here. Oh boy. Now we got to get the Luma. There we go. There, now it's coming along. Okay. Now we can take this crazy lady in front of the green screen, find myself a good bit of her. Boy, it's been a while since I've edited. And modify, unlink them, so I get rid of the audio. Clean up the top, come back to the project. Remember that audio file? That's right. We're going to put Rigoletto underneath cats. Alright, so there we go. And now when we go back to the master, Act Fred has been severely truncated and now has all the effects. You get the point now. Whatever changes you make to the nested sequence is reflected in the master sequence. Not as fully integrated as it is in Final Cut X, but at least you don't have to play around with iMovie Pro. You have an actual editing program here. Okay. Think that pretty much concludes it. If you have any further questions, let me know. I'll make a new video. Greg Wyatt, out.